a second coffee, and today with this warm afternoon will be a little bit more challenging. I will ask all the participants on the panel to take a seat. Initially, we were 6 panelists plus the chair. Finally, Emmanuel Garnier, he's not able to come, so we will be 5. And this is the table. And as it is this session after the lunch, and I think that the most important is the interaction with you. I have requested them to be very short. So we will organize this panel as a first short intervention of any one of us and try to save the maximum of time for the discussion with you. So the idea is to provide some highlights. It's impossible to present all the results of the projects, all the small details of the subject. It's just some highlights, and I think that the most important will be to try to discuss with you. So we count on you to help us to raise this debate and discussion, even if it is the time of the nap, but we will try to get this. I will start myself with the first presentation to set the scene. And as Emmanuel is not here, I will take a little bit more of time to do this. And after we will have these first interventions of any one of the panelists and then the discussion. So please, the first presentation. Thank you. I suppose this is working. So I am Daniel Sempre Torres from the university, the Polytechnical University of Catalonia. And of course, I want to start saying that in times of changes, climate changes, but other changes like increase of urbanization, fires, whatever that are affecting, what we have as floods and droughts is an increase in the last years. This is a graphic coming from Munich Re, that from 1980, we have multiplied by 3 the number of disasters due to the meteorological storms, hydrological floods, landslides, and avalanches, and the climatological events like extreme temperatures, droughts, and forest fires. This is the situation in which we are living now, the sustained increase of events. And when we go to the damages, these are the number of events with economic losses over 1 billion per event. In this, in yellow, you have the 80s, in blue, the 90s, and in red, the last decade, 2007, 2016. As you have heard before, 2017 has been the most damaged year, let me say, in the series, but this is for these 10 years. And what we can see again is an increase of the number of events over $1 billion damages, specifically most important in severe storms and flooding, also in wildfires and droughts. But the number that it's really impressing is the severe storms and floodings. Let me summarize a little bit the differences between two parts of the picture on floodings. One, we can have riverine floods, but it applies also to coastal floods, and what we call flash floods, or the floods that are related to pluvial phenomena and storms that are increasing very much, as you have seen. The first is the time. In one side, we have times that are of about days. The other side, we have times of about quarters. And this is very important because it's have a big influence on the response. In the first side, we have that in riverine or in coast, we already know where a flood can occur, because this is the place in which we know that the river will be out of the bed or the coast can invade the space. So we know where, we can do mapping of the risk, we can propose defense and structural measures, and we can plan. This is very important. Planning is crucial in this side. Whereas in the other side, they can be anywhere. They can be not in an exact place. Every place can be touched by a flood due to heavy rains or storms. And the probability is increasing with the climate change, with the heavy rains increase, and with the urbanization and impervious areas development. So structural measures are out of questions, and the real-time management of the response is crucial, and they make a big difference between planning and response in real time. And in the first case, we know what to do. We can do river restoration, floodplain recuperation, management of the coastal zone, evacuation. In the second hand, we don't know what we can do. And we need a new paradigm. We need a shift of mentality, because the only way to face these flash floods and storms-related emergencies is a change of paradigm in which the citizens become responsible of a part of the total responsibility. We need to work to make possible that the society assumes their own responsibility. It is impossible to project the idea that the civil protection, the army, whatever, will come with a helicopter to rescue you. It's not possible. You need to be able to respond. So this is really a step ahead. And this means that we need self-protection plans, flood risk management plans, self-protection capacities, tools to raise the capacity of the society to be self-protected and respond themselves. Regarding floods, we have a system that is the European Flood Awareness System, EFAS, developed by the Commission, by the Joint Research Center. Is a success in itself, I think. It's a clear example of how the transfer from European projects to the reality, operational things, it can be a success. It started 2003 after the project EFS. 10 years later, after the project of imprints, we added to the EFA system the flash flood capabilities. It was initially only foreseen for big rivers. Then it went to operational, so it's operational from 2013. And now we have added the capacity of including the radar and not just the numerical model. So if we take this case as an example of success, we have that from 72 hours ahead up to 6 hours ahead, based on the forecast in meteorological models, we can have different products in which we can go from the warnings about floods in rivers, about flash floods, and recently coastal floods. We have had also the capacity to go to the nowcasting capabilities based on radar from 2 hours to 6 hours ahead. And this is including these kind of indicators in the EFA system. So we have a tool, a very powerful tool adapted for the operational system during the floods. But the problem and the big challenge is that it is not accessible. It's only for a selected group of institutions that have signed the agreement for the EFAS community. So this information can be used, for instance, in a project like anywhere in which We are coordinating. Anywhere is for covering all the weather-induced emergencies, and we have developed a multi-hazard early warning system in which we have included the IFA system, all of them, but for the purpose of the project. But now we are facing that we cannot use all this system, all this data, all these capabilities we have operationally to other purposes, because it's not allowed. The institutions that have promoted IFAs don't want to share the information in the 21st century. And these institutions are the National Weather and Hydrological Services that don't want to share with the rest of the population their information. And this is the present situation in flooding. So anywhere we will try to move this to the civil protections for a more efficient response, and we want to open the box and go to the tools that can help self-protection for the citizens. And the main barrier is that our public system generating the data don't want that we share this data. This is one of the points. I'm just finishing with saying that this multi-hazard in the project Anywhere covers all these hazards. We have products for forecast and warning on all weather-induced emergencies. And I have a video of 3 minutes that I will just project to give you a good idea and some pictures about what is a flood, and then we will go to the panelists.
From the earliest times, extreme weather and climate events have tested the resilience of organized society. Every single year, thousands of lives are tragically lost due to harsh weather conditions directly impacting our communities and our economies, damaging infrastructure and causing losses of more than 200 billion euros globally. The main purpose of the Anywhere project is to empower exposed responder institutions and citizens, enhancing their preparedness and ability to respond to extreme and high-impact weather and climate-induced emergencies. For this reason, under the coordination of the Centre for Applied Research in Hydrometeorology at the Technical University of Catalonia, 31 institutions from 12 European countries participate in the innovation action of the European Commission's Horizon 2020 programme. Specifically, 12 operational authorities, 13 research and development partners, and 6 companies are involved in order to integrate the main related scientific and technological advancements of the last decade into an operational platform. Its main aim is to translate available meteorological forecasts into advanced, impact-based, multi-hazard forecasts before the extreme climate and weather events occur. This is done in an atmosphere of innovation and co-ownership among all the key protagonists, including scientists, developers, enterprises, first responders, and emergency managers. An atmosphere that for the Anywhere project is crucial to ensure that the users are driving the developments from the very beginning to get results that satisfy their needs. From its first design to its validation in the emergency control centres of the selected pilot sites. By supporting our emergency managers and first responders to anticipate the impacts and helping them to mobilise their resources when and to where they will be most efficient, the damage and deaths caused every year by flash floods, storm surges, landslides, forest fires, heat waves, droughts, snow or windstorms, etc. will be greatly reduced. This is the ultimate purpose of the Anywhere project.
Thank you very much. I will invite the first speaker, that will be Elisa Vargas. from the European Commission, DG Environment.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you to the organizers. Thank you to Philippe for the invitation. And yeah. So I will be speaking very briefly about droughts and policy related from the European Commission side and what we expect a bit on the way forward on the technical responses. So I haven't included the information here on the differences between water scarcity and droughts, but as I was asked to give a general enough presentation that could be followed by any type of audience. So just to mention as an introduction that we differentiate between drought as a meteorological event from water scarcity, which we consider more human-induced and which is more related to the demands, water demands exceeding availability of resources. So it's more like, as I said, more a human-induced problem than the natural phenomenon that we defined as drought. So it's a natural event linked to low precipitation. It's actually normal and recurrent in different climates, and it's highly variable in time and scale. And there are several indicators that are usually used to follow drought and to identify the events, such as SPI, soil moisture, or vegetation stress-related indices. So usually the management is more focused on the impact, and we have seen over the years that probably more action is needed on the forecasting, on the risk prevention, planning, and insurance. And as I was mentioned by Daniel, there are several costs involved, but actually for drought events, this is a bit hard to quantify due to the slow set of the events and also because of the different sectors that are usually impacted by drought events. Also, this was mentioned by Daniel, we expect that climate change effects will actually have a high impact on droughts. And these will most likely be worsened, both in intensity and frequency. And this, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has actually predicted that this will happen mainly in areas that we consider semi-arid or arid, which means that these are usually areas that are already affected by water scarcity problems. So this combination might actually create extreme challenges for water managers. Also, what we have mentioned in several policy recommendations and policy papers is that the lifespan of gray infrastructure, such as dam, might be severely affected. And this is linked to the expected decrease of river flows and higher sediment rates. So regarding the EU policy response in general to water scarcity and droughts, because we have done this response together, there are several tools. I will not go into the detail of all the tools and reports, but just to give you a broad overview, there was a Commission communication specifically on water scarcity and droughts back in 2007, and there were several follow-up reports in the following years. And actually, member states were quite active in providing information through questionnaires and through data gathering that was later reflected on the follow-up report. Also, in 2012, we had the water blueprint communication, and linked to this communication, there was an in-depth policy assessment, including a water scarcity and drought part, which produced different technical reports. And there are several other activities, technical guidance, case studies, especially on water accounts that were running through 2012 through 2015. And in addition, what we really try is to coordinate efforts with other entities, such as, for instance, the European Environment Agency, the JRC, and also Eurostat and other other DGs, especially for water accounting the projects on accounting for natural capital and ecosystem services. So I have provided links to all the different documents and communications and so on. And as Daniel said, what I will try is to focus more on the policy approach and what we expect on the way forward to kind of invite you to provide comments, questions, and have some sort of brainstorming on this. So on the policy approach, what we have expressed through the different communications is that we consider that in the long term, it's more important to manage demand than actually increasing supply. This is especially important for areas that are already affected by water scarcity and droughts. And we have tried to provide recommendations and try to invite member states to put more efforts in what we consider water efficiency, for instance, in urban supply networks, also in agriculture, industry, and other sectors. We have also promoted quite a lot the use of natural water retention measures, in contrast to the traditional use of gray infrastructures. Also the increase of and the potential of water reuse, and actually very recently the Commission has adopted a regulation which is publicly available. And on the water management side, we have promoted more control of permits and also control of illegal abstractions, which are quite a problem in some Mediterranean countries. And on the pricing policy, we consider that there's quite a lot of room for efficiency allocation, and as I mentioned already, also the use of natural water retention measures and not so much the traditionally gray infrastructures that are commonly used in water-scarce areas. One more? I'm almost done. So on the way forward, we are actually currently assessing the second river basin management plans, and we are right now starting on what we call the fitness check, or the evaluation of the main water policy, which is a water framework directive. And my colleague Ioannis will probably elaborate a bit more on the fitness check, but just to mention that we're right now assessing the second river basin management plans, and we expect to have a better idea of how member states have integrated water scarcity and droughts issues. But what we saw already on the first cycle is that this integration was quite weak, and the use of water balances and water accounts in general was very limited, and also the use of water pricing and incentives to make a better use of water and making water use more efficient. And so, for instance, in the program of measures, we already saw in the first cycle that very few member states have made use of alternative measures, such as natural water retention measures, or did very limited work on climate proofing, the measures included in these programs. So now we will have a more updated picture of what has happened in this sense. But in general, what we have already recommended is that we expect better coordination of policies, for instance, in land use, agriculture, and better coherence among the different plans. So not only river basin management plans, but several countries, for instance, have drought management plans, and the coherence of these plans, which are directly linked to water management, is not so obvious in some cases. We also call for more mobilization of sources and water efficiency measures. And also, the title of the presentation was Droughts as an Emergent Risk. We are seeing that droughts are occurring in areas where perhaps the experience is not so solid, and we're seeing some problems, for instance, in the Danube countries. So what we are proposing is a better exchange and learning from other regions that have been more exposed in the past. And also, well, as I mentioned, it's harder to quantify impacts and quantify the losses linked to droughts harder than to floods. because of slow response and the impacts in several sectors. But we expect a better use of advanced tools such as early warning, better monitoring, or programs such as Copernicus that was also in one of the slides. So I think that's it. Thank you very much. I hope I was on time.
Thank you very much, Elisa. I call Ioannis Kavadas, also from the DG Environment, to CoU.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'll try to give you within 5 minutes an idea of where we are with the policy making and the policy implementation in the area of floods. So the whole story started in 2002, as you may know, with some severe floods in Central and Eastern Europe. It was obvious that something needed to do at the European level, and the European institutions and the member states decided that it's time to act, and so we came up with the Floods Directive. The Floods Directive is largely modeled on two main aspects. One, water management, where it has used the concepts of the Water Framework Directive. So look at the whole river basin. That includes the coastal areas, of course. So look at the whole river basin and try to understand how water interacts with its environment. And then secondly, take a risk management approach. So be cyclical, identify, evaluate, and react. So by following this approach, the member states who were called upon implementing the Floods Directive have, in terms of identification, prepared preliminary flood risk assessments. Based on the preliminary flood risk assessments, which was looking back at the historical floods and looking forward at potential floods, have identified the areas around which they should be paying more attention and taking action. The second stage, the second phase was the evaluation part of the risk management cycle. So then the member states prepared flood hazard and risk maps, where flood hazard is understanding the extent of the hazard, so the area that would be covered by water, and flood risk maps. Those maps would show which are our assets, including our peoples, who are at risk from the flood. So hospitals, churches, monuments, Natura 2000 areas, etc., etc. And the final, and these maps were centered, built, prepared around the areas of potentially significant flood risk, because we are looking at significant flood risk in the Floods Directive. And the third step in the risk management cycle was the reaction, and the reaction is based on producing flood risk management plans, by analogy to the river basin management plans, so flood risk management plans, where the member states had, for these areas which were identified and mapped, they had to prepare plans where objectives would be set, classically to reduce flood risk. Objectives would be set, and measures would be designed, so as to achieve these objectives. And this, so the focus of the Floods Directive is on preparedness, protection, and prevention, which is already a departure from the situation that we had previously, where the whole focus was on protection only, and not thinking so much how to avoid the nasty situation up front instead of just fighting it. And we are now in a position to assess these flood risk management plans that the member states have produced. And this is a cyclical process, so in 6 years and 6 years thereafter, the member states will be updating their assessments, their mapping, and the planning. I've mentioned already several times that we are working with the member states. We are doing this within a process which is called the Common Implementation Process, which we have found over the years that it is helping a lot, because it is bringing together, first of all, the member states with the other member states. So there is a lot of exchange of information and good practice. And there is also a lot of discussion on how things should be implemented in a better way. Now, in terms of findings in the flood risk management plans, we should say upfront that the Floods Directive created a framework. It didn't prescribe a lot of things. It made reference, however, to a lot of things, but prescriptive it was not. Very prescriptive it was not. We see, nevertheless, that through the numerous interactions with the member states, that the member states have followed up on a lot of issues which are central to finding a solution to the flood risk problem. So the member states have largely, not every member state and not all member states have excelled in all areas, but largely we can say that the member states have paid attention to climate change, so they are incorporating information and research and knowledge about climate change more and more. So the member states are aware that they need to tackle the flood problem, including the floodplains, which were disconnected from the rivers. The member states know that they need to work with nature-based solutions. The member states are aware, and we see more and more discussion about insurance as one of the tools to react to flooding. The member states know that they now need to finance these measures that they have decided to implement. We see that there is a lot more interaction with civil protection, whereas the Commission proposal for the Floods Directive included prevention, protection, and preparedness, and also measures immediately after the flood event. This was not the operations immediately after the flood were not included in the Floods Directive, but the member states have come to realize, and we are glad to see this, that the civil protection part, so the immediate response after the disaster is important. So civil protection is drawn or is a valuable part of the solution. We also see that the Floods Directive has inspired the general disaster response area, all the other natural disasters that Daniel was showing us in his presentation. So we can say that overall there has been a lot of progress over the past 10, 11 years. Member states which had a certain way of doing things have updated their approaches. Member states which were just starting to deal with flood risk have made huge progress as well. What remains to be seen is whether we will have an implementation of what is in the plans, whether the member states will be able to quantify the progress and be concrete about what has been achieved. And of course, then we will see how the future plans will look like. But we remain very positive. You see, it's a positive picture. There are shortcomings. We are going to make public everything that we will be producing, so member states' reports, which are looking individually at the member states. We will be publishing an EU overview, which will be discussing the landscape in the whole of the European Union. As Elisa was saying, we are conducting, we have started with the fitness check process. That's basically an evaluation of the large part of the water legislation in the EU. There will be a public consultation and consultations more focused on specialist audience like yourselves. This will be taking place over the summer, maybe in the first months of the autumn as well. It is going to be four months. So you are invited to keep an eye on this, and you are very welcome to participate and give your opinion on that. Thank you very much.
Next presenter is Ab van Dokkeren, from coordinator of Riskit project and from Delta-Res.
Okay. So I'll take you to the coast. I'll present some of the results of the Riskit project that ended last year. It was funded still under the old program, Framework Program 7, concurrently with the Pearl project. Professor Vujinovic is here. I hope that we have a kind of consistent result. So I'm going to be talking about early warning system and also risk assessments to reduce coastal impacts. But I'm starting out with what we heard this morning, that there's more climate change effects in Southern Europe than in Northern Europe. In Holland and in other low-lying areas, we do have a problem. These are some projections of sea level rise. These are high-end scenarios for the Dutch coast. This is a report that will come out next week. The take-home here is that we see this sea level rise measured here. These are our current scenarios, and this is what could happen with ice shelf collapse in Antarctica. And the take-home here is that we're going to have this, and riding on top of that, we're going to have storm surges, we're going to have waves, we're going to have coastal erosion, but this is going to be a major driver. One of the things here that I pointed out is, say you're here at this time, 2050, and you want to prepare for 50 centimeters of sea level rise. Then you have about 20 years to prepare. But if you start thinking about it here, then you only have 10 years to prepare. Typical projects take about 30 years, and then you're quite fast in developing an infrastructure project. So if you want to prepare for the sea level rise, you have to start thinking way ahead when the signal still isn't there. The other take-home here is that we conventionally cut off the timeline here at 2100. So what's going to happen after 2100? Is everything going to go down? Probably not. It's going to keep going. So, so what are we going to do about it? So in order to keep safe on the coast, we need to start to invest in protection. But where and how and what solutions? Those are the questions that we asked in the Riskit project. We mapped the products on the DRR, disaster management cycle. So you have a storm, an impact, you have a response, you have the recovery, prevention, and preparedness. That's the usual cycle. And we mapped our products. So what was the impact of an event? So we recorded some of the impacts. Where are the hotspots? Where do you need to invest? So that's a screening tool. Then what are potential solutions? What works in what areas and what doesn't? We have a web-based management guide. And then you want to investigate what are effective solutions, what works, and how do you warn residents? So what's an early warning tool? And then finally, our fifth tool is what are suitable solutions? So what is appropriate for the local population? What do they accept and what are they used to? So if we go to early warning system and risk assessment, we typically do a model train, and then this is kind of a schematic. And we have offshore boundary conditions, and we have to transform them onto the coast. So the point here is that we typically do waves and surge offshore, but our challenge is to project them into onshore hazards, so beach erosion and inundation and flooding, and then start computing the impact. So what happens to the residents, what happens to the houses, what happens to the receptors? And then computation is very expensive, so our way forward is to cast that into a Bayesian network. That's kind of a smart lookup table where you compute a lot of results in advance, and when a storm happens, you can zoom in on particular conditions. And then you want to know, so, okay, I have a potential impact. What happens then? What is the effectiveness of some of these disaster risk reduction measures? So what happens if I do a beach nourishment? Does it help? What happens if I rezone, so remove houses? Does that help? And I have some examples of that. So this is a way forward, is to compute all the possible conditions, water levels, wave heights, peak periods, storm durations, and project them on all possible outcomes. Now here we have overwash depth and erosion at buildings, and this is for Praia de Faro. This is one of our case study sites. This is in Portugal. And what you can do, you can say, okay, I have all these conditions. I computed them in advance. I don't have to do that anymore. They're in a smart lookup table. And now I say, okay, I have a storm with certain conditions. I want to look at a particular locations. And then instantly you can say, okay, this will cause a certain hazard. So I have to start to evacuate people. And this we've done for 9 case study sites in Europe, but this can be rolled out across Europe. As Daniel said, a smart way forward is also to not only do early warning systems, but also to look at planning. So now we're looking at a hypothetical scenario, again on this Praia de Faro for consistency. We looked at overwash potential, and then we looked at some of the DRR measures. So what happens if we do nourishment and a house removal? And you can see that here about a quarter of the houses would be potentially damaged. But with these interventions, nourishment is not that controversial, but house removal is very contentious. You can reduce the damage. So that would be a way forward to make your coast more resilient. So early warning systems and planning ahead are two things that you should do on the coast. Now, some of these measures, I'm almost done. Some of these measures you don't have to do all at once. And this is a method that's designed by one of my colleagues in another European project, Dynamic Adaptive Policy Pathway. You have to see this as kind of metro lines. So say you want to protect your coast, you start with beach nourishments, but if your sea level rise goes up to a certain level, that is the end of the line. You switch to another line of your metro and you start to raise your dunes, and that, at some point that doesn't work anymore, and then you go to another measure. But the point is here that you can stack measures on top of each other, and it doesn't only work for coastal, but it also works for other areas. This is a very effective way also to communicate to local residents and end users. So we cast some of these things in the recommendations, in the policy brief. It's available on our website, riskit.eu, and this is the specifics, but if you go to the main site, you can find them. The main point is we're now computing early warning systems based on offshore water levels and wave heights, but we really have to go to impacts. What does it mean for people? Does it really matter if my water level is high if I don't have waves? So you have to have that combination, and you have to look at the impacts. There is a lot of coastal risk information that can be used in advance to see where you need to optimize investments and interventions, and that is driven by a lot of input, like topography, your elevation, your bathymetry. We found that there is still a lot of inconsistency in Europe on these data sets, so that needs to be parameterized. And also the impacts, which we started to collect, was mentioned this morning. Good validation data is really necessary, and it needs to be collected in a consistent way. And the final point is that don't look at individual DRR measures, but look at sequences of these. And don't forget about ecosystem-based solutions. They can work, but usually in combination with other solutions as well. So not a standalone, but in combination with other things, they can really help. That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next speaker will be Dave Stewart from the Torbay Council, representing the project EU Circle.
Right, thank you, Daniel. Good afternoon. Right, yeah. The EU Circle project is actually on the effects of climate change on critical infrastructure during extreme natural events such as droughts, forest fires and flooding. Obviously, for this one, we're focusing on the Torbay case study, which is actually on coastal flooding. The aim of the project is to develop tools to assist in making the interconnected and interdependent critical infrastructure more resilient to climate change. And as part of that, we've developed a validated critical infrastructure resilience platform that can assess potential impacts due to climate hazards, provide monitoring through new resilience indicators, support cost-effective adaptation measures, and within this we need to actively involve stakeholders. As you can see, I'm Torbay Council. I am a partner in the project, but I am also a stakeholder because of the works we're doing within the Bay. So looking at Torbay itself, for those of you who don't know it, we're in the southwest of England. We're a major tourist resort, and it's made up of Torquay, Paignton and Brixham. And historically, we have suffered flooding from various sources over many years. Just some photos of some of the flooding events we've had. Coastal flooding events closes the main roads linking the three towns. We get surface water flooding, sewer flooding and watercourse flooding. The top two are the main town centre of Torquay being flooded. That happens on mostly about every 3 or 4 years. We've also had a breach failure back in 2013 following a major easterly storm event that damaged the main sewer rising main that linked or transferred all of Torquay's sewage to the sewage treatment works. This year, while we've been doing the case study, we had Storm Emma, which is a 1 in 75-year storm event that caused significant damage to critical infrastructure. As you can see, again, similar photos in Torquay and again in the main tourist area of Paignton. The impacts of flooding, I'll just highlight a couple of things. Over 1,500 properties at risk of flooding in Torbay, and the major industry is tourism. 3 million tourists bringing in £450 million to the economy. Once we get flooding, that is significantly hit. You've heard about the effects of climate change. I'll just concentrate on sea level. In Torbay, sea level is predicted to rise by over 1 metre in the next 100 years. Obviously, that will increase the risk of the overtopping and flooding to properties. As part of the case study, we've actually actively involved stakeholders, not only ourselves as Torbay Council, but we've had all the other critical infrastructure owners involved in it. We hold an initial stakeholder workshop where we actually discussed all the impacts that the flooding can have on the critical infrastructure. We then agreed the scenarios that the stakeholders would like us to investigate as part of the case study. Also identified the climate changes they wanted us to check through or cover in it. And they actually identified some questions that they would like answered to prove whether the actual tools that we developed would work for them. The questions you can see highlighted there. Obviously, because of needing all the information on critical infrastructure, it was very data heavy, the information, but the stakeholders were happy to provide us with all that data. We actually identified also interdependencies between the critical infrastructure assets in order that we can then calculate both direct and indirect costs and damages during flooding events. All the information that you've seen identified there is fed into the SERP tool so that it can then actually be used to actually model the flood events and work out the damages associated with those flooding events. If we now just look at a couple of the results for Paignton in 2065, so this is with 50 years of climate change. The first slide on your left actually shows the areas that will be flooded from a joint probability event. So this was actually a 1 in 50-year rainfall event with a 1 in 50-year coastal event. So you can see it actually takes a lot of the area of Paignton out with flooding. So in that is the main tourist area where we've got lots of hotels, guest houses, residential properties, railway, roads, electricity substations, sewer pumping stations, a lot of critical infrastructure in that would be affected. The second one is actually the 1 in 200-year coastal event. And as again, you can see overtopping of it will flood all the area right the way back and slightly beyond the main railway line. Interestingly, the third one, which shows very little flooding, is an adaptation event that we ourselves as Torbay Council wanted to run. We are looking, and we've been trying to secure funding for a scheme to actually improve the sea defences in Paignton. And what we've actually done is we had a look as part of the case study over various different types of ways. That is actually for a secondary defence wall set back about 10 metres from the existing sea wall, 1.6 metres high. And we ran it, and as you can see, we have vastly reduced the risk of flooding for the 1 in 200-year event with 50 years of climate change. I myself will now be preparing a business case to go to the Environment Agency and central government to try to secure funding for this scheme. So the actual case study itself has been very beneficial for the evidence that I can put forward. Just so you're seeing some of the questions that they raised at the start of the stakeholders. How many, let's just clear that one. So one of them was how many residential and commercial properties would be flooded. This is, again, the 200-year coastal event. So there's 743 residential, 439 commercial properties. Residents affected by the flooding was 1,780. Total damages, this is indirect and direct costs for that event. For residential was approximately £19 million, so that's about 21 million euros. And commercial property is nearly £30 million worth of damage, so quick calculation, about £36 million worth of euros. I do have a video that we were going to prepare, but obviously I'm running out of time. It is going to be being played where you're having refreshments at the next break, so hopefully you can see it there. But we held the dissemination workshop for the case study at the end of March this year. And at the end of it, having had questionnaires with the stakeholders and that, they actually agreed that the case study had demonstrated that the tools that we developed can be used successfully to assess the effects of climate change on critical infrastructure within Torbay. And a lot of the stakeholders are wanting to carry on with the works after the case study or after the project is finished and make use of it. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Dave. And our last speaker will be Lawrence Marcel from CERCO, representing the eOpen project.
Hello, and thank you. Lawrence Marcel from CERCO. Thank you, Philippe, for the introduction and the invite. Really, I'm just going to talk not about the project, but really just about decision-making and information and how it might be used for societal resilience and having citizens and communities play a part in that resilience, whether it be flooding or other. eOpen, a usual H2020, a number of partners across Europe, and we have 3 case studies. And just quickly looking at this here, it's really about information, data collection, and that information is including social media, includes citizens and communities. And you may have heard things about citizen observatories, and we have a big focus on citizens in part of the early warning provision of information and data in flood resilience. We have a big involvement in Earth observation imagery. At my company, CERCO, we primarily look after the Copernicus data, Earth observation imagery, which Alicia mentioned earlier. And it's really about how we take that Earth observation imagery and how we integrate it and use it as part of the intelligence mix for decision-making. How do we take that imagery? How do we integrate it with social media? How do we integrate it with other forms of sensors for flood monitoring and resilience? We're using a lot of technology and other forms of applications with some of our partners, such as the High Performance Computing Center in Stuttgart, or NOAA, the National Observatory of Athens, who are doing a lot of the technical work, looking at big data analytics and so on, how that information, how that data is integrated and used. And we have 3 case studies. And one is flooding resilience in Vicenza in Italy, where we're running, it's primarily around resilience, where we're focusing on citizens and that citizen observatory input alongside other data. We have the Finnish Meteorological Institute, who are looking at climate change. And the third one is our South Korean partner, Korean University, where we're looking at food security supply. So very, very different scenarios. But the important thing is about the ability to take data from multiple sources, including citizens, integrate that with other forms of information, such as Earth observation in this case, and use it as part of that monitoring, planning, preparedness, and response mechanism. So my role in this is really about the information, about the decision-making and the governance of that information. And really, this is just the blueprint, which I'm not going to go into massive amounts of detail. But we take our use cases, we take scenarios, so we take 3 scenarios from each of those pilot areas. And what we do is we're using an architecture, which in this case we call JDIG, the Joint Decision and Information Governance Architecture. Now, it's an architecture which we are using in other H2020 projects, Unity, which is community policing. And it's really, the architecture is just about understanding complexity. How does an ecosystem of communities and all of those multiple stakeholders function. What are the roles? What are the responsibilities? What are the decision-making, information requirements? What are the constraints across 4 capability areas? Governance, people, process, and technology. So we look at those and we build what we call a current operating model. So that's a deconstruction of scenarios in flood resilience, climate change, and food supply. We take scenarios written by the stakeholders in each case, we deconstruct them, and we build up an accurate set of business process flows, which tells us how those organizations, whether they're public, private, or voluntary, or citizen, how they function in that current model against those scenarios. What we then do is we do a delta analysis, it's a gap analysis, and we use that to understand in subjective and objective terms what works and what doesn't work. So it may be an instance where one organization doesn't trust another organization because they provide information, but that information never gets actioned, or they never get feedback about that information. So that's from a subjective perspective. An objective view may be that we cannot transfer data, or we cannot share plans because of governance, because of data protection, or because of some technical constraint, or maybe a legal constraint. So we take that, we build that into the architecture, and then we run a series of workshops to understand how we innovate. How do we innovate in terms of governance, policies, strategies, doctrine, people, the culture, the training, the behaviors, processes and procedures which are used, and the technology, the systems which are used to enable that to work. And then when we innovate, we build what we call a target operating model, which is our desired model, where we want to get to. And that target operating model, in the case of EOPEN, will be with how we have taken the Earth observation imagery in all of its various different forms, integrated it with citizen and community information from social media and with other sensor data. And what we then do is we run pilots and exercises like most H2020 projects to understand whether our target operating model and the recommendations for innovation that we've made works. And we test them, and we provide test beds to see if that can be then implemented back into the organizations. And really, what we're trying to do, and the brief that I was given by Daniel and Philippe, is about social resilience and the community aspects. So really what we're trying to do is on the left, in any forms of resilience, and I have projects which are looking at serious organized crime, community policing, critical infrastructure protection. What we find is that in most cases, stakeholders, whether they're public sector or private sector or voluntary or citizens themselves, the space, the shared understanding of risk, and the shared journey to move forward to a set of achievable, meaningful shared outcomes is very small. So the space in the middle, the resilient space, is very, very small. And what we are doing, and we're proving in one H2020 project, which finished just last week for community policing, is the architecture and the ability to step back, for all stakeholders to step back, shared and collective understanding of risk, and then journey forward together towards a set of shared outcomes, whether it's for resilience, whether it's for serious organized crime or community policing, increases the shared space. So that shared space is increasing that shared understanding. It's not reducing capability, it's not reducing capacity, but what it is doing is increasing shared understanding, and with a set of with a shared understanding and with intelligence, which is a unified view of the world, you're able to have informed negotiation between the stakeholders as to how you achieve a set of better informed decisions and shared outcomes. And that's me done.
So now it's your turn. I don't know where the micros are, if there is some micro there. Yes, Bernardo. Perfect. Who starts? Here.
Thank you. I think that was a really very intelligently designed panel. I really enjoyed that. At the beginning, you raised the question that seems so obvious, public services unwilling to share information with the publics that are really affected by the information and the issues covered by that information, which makes it sound so unreasonable. And then you have all these presentations that say why they don't share and how that information is very political, very intricate, very complex, very difficult. And then you end with you talking about opening a space for contestation and engagement. So my question, I guess, is to you now, about how inclusive are those spaces and how do they really help address the reasons why it is so difficult to share information?
So that's a really, really interesting question. And I won't use an example for this project because this EOPEN project only started in November. So we're slowly going through. But fundamentally, what we're talking about, whether we're talking about flood resilience or whether we're talking about community policing or critical infrastructure protection, we are talking about societal resilience at a high level. And societal resilience is made up of a number of different component parts: community policing, serious organized crime, and all of those organizations. So if you take serious organized crime, and that's the example I'll use, if you take serious organized crime, it's viewed as a separate discipline, a separate domain. Well, the reality is it isn't. It's part of that building block of societal resilience. And I'm working with the UK Home Office, with a number of police forces in the UK, and the UK Home Office has a serious organised crime strategy, which is about all of the partners and how those partners, which are health, education, local authorities, community safety partnerships, critical infrastructure, private sector, how they play a role in serious organised crime. And on the surface, one would think, well, why does the health service have a role in serious organised crime? Well, if you look at consequences, if you look at symptoms of serious organised crime, they manifest themselves in every single area: in health, in education, vulnerable children, trafficking, immigration, and so on. So, firstly, the domain, serious organised crime, or flood resilience, or critical infrastructure protection, are firstly viewed as separate domains. They're not. The structural issues that you find in all of those things, where you have multiple stakeholders who need to understand shared risks and threats, who then need to work together to achieve a set of shared outcomes, those structural issues are exactly the same. So if you encourage people, stakeholders, public, private, voluntary, to step back, to understand the shared risks and threats, vulnerabilities and hazards of the system, the area in question, to step back, understand what those are, and then identify who has the role, responsibility, capability, and capacity to meet those from a collective perspective, and then you travel forward with a mechanism to achieve a set of shared outcomes, you find that what were seen as separate disciplines in silos with separate organizations in a separate domain all of a sudden become actually shared.
Was it my house is one of the houses that I want to remove? Yeah, what if my house is one of the houses that you want to remove?
Yeah.
And I don't like it.
Yeah. I don't want to. So what we're showing is it's actually a good example. This Praia de Faro. So we showed which houses are most vulnerable, and then of course it's a really difficult process to convince people that they should move back or they should elevate their houses. Yeah, the money is involved, but also some of these areas they were fishermen, and the town council said you should move away, but they live near the coast for a reason, because they are fishermen and they live there all their lives, and they said, move to the other side of the island. So there's two fishing communities. One is supporting Benfica, the other one is supporting Sporting. This sounds trivial, but they were not going to merge into one town. So they are separate groups. So we did a study, we looked academically what's the best solution, and then what we did do is we had community meetings at all these case study sites to look at these solutions. And I gave a presentation, I think 2 years ago here, where some of these results. And in Holland we say it's a little bit of a cold water, fear of cold water, to jump in. But our scientists did it, and we had a really good partner to facilitate this process, and it really worked. We really got some good insights into it, and people could see what good solutions are and what bad solutions are, and they could understand each other's point of view. So I think part of the thing is that we have to step out of academia and really go into the community, translate some of our results. Some of the results are hard to interpret, but we have to share it, not dumb it down, but make it more simple. And there's ways to do it, and there's techniques to approach all kinds of stakeholders and end users to not only provide them with insight in what could happen, but also get a lot of feedback of what's suitable. Because that was one of our tools, is what's the suitability of interventions, what's socially acceptable, and what's the historic aspect. So there's a lot we can learn from the community, and yeah, I think we just need to be able to interact with them.
Philippe?
Yeah, I would like to have, in fact, a few comments to challenge you a little bit, because half of my heart is scientist, the other one is policy. So I was fed with what you have described us with respect to policy and science, but I was not really convinced about what you said about the engagement of other people. For example, from the policy part, how did you engage the scientific community to feed your reporting about the water frame directive or flood directive? And from the science part, well, it's very interesting what you have shown, but I don't understand, I don't see how you involve citizens, regional authorities, practitioners, first responders. You don't say it. And I know that you did, but we are here in a community who want to understand where you are positioning yourself with respect to this community building. And if you speak about storm hub, my parents have been flooded through the Cynthia storm, and it's why Risk It and Pearl has born, because I wanted to have something more on research done. And I can tell you that the science and the decision-making process that was done at that time were very far from the state of the art and the involvement of citizens. And what you say, the people who were there with houses of 2 or 3 centuries ago would have liked to have some insight into the period of return of this kind of event. It's a pity that Emmanuel Garnier is not here, because he would have told you that this kind of storm is coming back every 80 or 100 years. And there are houses that were flooded, but the decision is to displace or rezone or destroy houses only because it has been flooded by a coastal submersion is bullshit, if it's not based on historical data. So it's a little bit my heart, thing, but it's also to tell you that we have indeed to create bridges between different disciplines again.
Some other comments? Hey, come on. I don't know if there is some people in the panel that want to address the point of...
Well, I wanted to reply to Philippe, although he knows this process very well. But regarding droughts, water scarcity and droughts, there was a huge debate and dialogue back 2005, 2006. And this was done within the common implementation strategy that you know very well. And that is probably one of the most successful examples in EU policy in terms of coordinating efforts from the different sectors. And this forum brings together member states, NGOs, stakeholders, academia. So we had a lot of participation from universities, from experts. There was a lot of discussion on indicators and so on. So I think it was very rich, and the general feeling after that was that no directive was needed at the time. Let's see what emerges from the whole fitness check of the Water Framework Directive and the evaluation, but I think the dialogue and the exchanges at the time were quite successful.
And is it taken over the revision?
Yes. This will be taken into account. In addition, I don't want to bore you with the details, but one of the topics, for instance, will be abstractions in the integrated assessment within the evaluation process. So hopefully we will have a more in-depth and more updated picture in terms of water scarcity and drought and over-abstraction problems, groundwater use, and so on.
Nicole and then...
Just a quick question to the world panel. Let's talk a bit about the future? Because in your presentation, you presented what you have done, which results have been achieved in different way. But now, which is your idea of doing the last mile? So being able, from a policy point of view, from a research point of view, to be actually able to reach the citizens, to increase their awareness, to increase, because we have seen a lot of very interesting results, but many times these results stay still there. And so which is your idea of how we can be very effective to reach the local communities, to reach the population, to make aware that there is a lot of knowledge at eye level, but also available for them?
Thank you. I'll answer my perspective, if I may. Citizens aren't stupid, and we all talk about empowering them and being part of it. And if we think about the political process, you know, politicians get voted by us, by the taxpayers. So, you know, I think it's about breaking down those barriers. I think it's about treating those citizens who are both part of the problem and part of the solution to it, just as one of those stakeholder groups. If we, as so-called experts at a policy and practitioner level, can work out how we break down our silos and barriers, and we're talking about, you know, flooding and coastal erosion, things like that. We're in silos. We are still it's just resilience. So if we can understand how to break down our silos so that we're looking at threat, risks, vulnerabilities, and hazards holistically, of which citizens are both affected by and have an ability to affect the planning, preparedness, response, and recovery, and if we treat them intelligently and as part of that stakeholder group, then that, you know, that's a paradigm shift and a transformation in how things are done. And then if procurements, you know, the procurements for council services, or if the procurements for transport, if those things were again looked at from a holistic perspective, as opposed to a transport procurement or a council service procurement, maybe around a societal resilience, quality of life perspective, I think we'd all be in a better place.
Obviously, being employed by a council, I have a responsibility to the general public of Torbay. And yes, it was unusual where I've been involved in a case study or anything like that to actually get a storm event of that magnitude that we're actually trying to model at the time when we're doing some research. So it's actually come in very fortuitous because we've been able to, as I said in the presentation, validate the work we've been doing by looking at that storm event, modeling it and seeing how it is. But we're actively involved in looking at doing protection to Paignton. Since Storm Emma hit, we've had the residents of Paignton on to me saying, will I come and do a presentation to them about what the proposals are? We've also got residents from Torquay asking that as well. Because obviously the way the council is set up, I have to first of all do a presentation to our councillors, get their permission and their acceptance of what we're proposing before I can go and present it to the members of the public. So we are still doing some further work, even though we've actually had the dissemination workshop. We are actually doing some further work, both with Exeter University and through the EU Circle project, but also with a separate consultant that we were doing some work with on coastal defences anyway. Once that is completed in the next month or so, I will be taking a report to the council, and then once they are happy with it, I will actually be going out and meeting the community partnerships in Paignton and Torquay. We've also put in, just so you're aware, in England, we have to actually secure granting aid funding, we have to apply to the Environment Agency and DEFRA with various proposals which are then scored on business cases and cost benefits, etc. I have actually included, following Storm Emma and the works we've done, 4 other coastal defence schemes as well to go forward in the future for Brixham and other smaller areas around Torquay. So I'm trying to secure funding to do coastal defence works right across the bay as a result of that. And I will actually be then taking it forward and meeting all the community partnerships, members of the public, to actually go through that process.
I will agree that citizens are certainly not stupid. They, however, require our assistance in terms of being educated and trained from an early age in terms of risk and probabilities. They need to be contacted as early as possible before the flood event, before the flood takes place, for 2 reasons. Because even if there was a flood in the past, and we know, we are almost certain there will be one in the future, people tend to forget about this, and then it's business as usual. So they need to be reminded. The phenomenon needs to be explained to them, and it's never too early to go to them and lay out even your draft plans. You know, we have identified this risk, be it floods or any other risk, and we are planning to take measures. And we have a palette of measures, and we are considering these, and we would like to listen to your opinions. This is always the best approach, because it's not the easiest approach, but it's the best approach, and perhaps the one that creates less friction. And not everyone is going to be happy, but most will be at the end of the day. So you engage with the citizens, they feel that they own the plans afterwards. Some will not want that their area is classified as a risk area, because they will be afraid that their houses will lose in value. Some will absolutely want their area to be classified as a risk area, because they will be hoping that there will be some measures taken from the state. So there's no straightforward approach to this. Every case is different, but engagement early on seems to be the best way forward.
Yeah, I have an example of that. It follows nicely what you're saying. Our Swedish partner had interaction with a local town for our case study site, and they had a forward-looking council member who wanted to be involved in this European project. And we're talking about coastal risks, which are not that prevalent on the Swedish coast. So we were involved in the project, and 2 years in, there was a coastal storm, and it was exactly something that we predicted. So then they called our partner in and said, hey, what were you talking about? Now, then it became really concrete. And I think that's, a part of it is awareness. So the awareness that there's something that they need to think about. And then the other thing is to turn a reactive strategy, like reacting to a storm, to something proactive. So then you can start to plan and protect their coast. So in their case, they're going to protect their dune system a bit better. So those are the things that we need to instill, that there is knowledge, and we need to make those connections and stay in touch with them. So hopefully in our case study site, there's lasting connections where we can provide information.
Yep. I think there is a question there, and 3 hands rising. So.
Okay, hello. Oops. A question for Elisa on water scarcity and drought. So I have the impression that over the recent years, there has been a lot smaller intensity on projects on drought and water scarcity. It used to be a lot more, like 5 to 10 years ago. Maybe, I don't know if you agree, of course. So my question is, do you see and do you have an indication that the research on water scarcity and drought might go up again now that drought is moving up north?
In terms of projects, perhaps
in recent years, we have not seen very large-scale research projects, but there are some cases, there are some examples. There are some asked my colleagues, so feel free to also to provide additional information on projects. But for instance, I think they have been more focused on specific problems. For instance, in guaranteeing water supply under crisis events. And you're distracted by the window. Okay, so there have been some. The answer is maybe not so large scales, but we have examples in different programs. So in LIFE program, for instance. And also, I think water is a very horizontal issue. So in the end, sometimes drought issues are included in more comprehensive and more risk-related large projects. Also, there are some examples of international projects, for instance, in Africa, with EU funds. And the second part of the question is whether we have done more in recent years, or? More. Oh, sorry. Well, it's a bit hard to predict. I mean, I don't have a crystal ball, but it's true that we are seeing problems in areas that do not have such a solid experience as other ones, as for instance, the Southern Europe or Mediterranean areas. And I gave the example of the Danube, but we have also seen a very intense and large activity in specific countries as the Netherlands, for example. And so I guess the idea I want to transmit it, yes, we're seeing now water scarcity and drought episodes where we didn't see them before. And the problem with that is that water managers are not so trained or so experienced in the area. But from the Commission side, what I can say is that we have tried to provide and put on the table several tools to make exchanges possible, and provide even experts to go on missions and try to not only exchange good practices or examples, but also to really give technical advice on how to incorporate in existing tools such as the river basin management plans. And one example of this tool is what we call the peer-to-peer tool. And it's basically what we provide as the funds, and experts kind of go to wherever they are needed to provide assistance for those countries and river basins that request this help.
Thanks. Yes, very interesting presentations, and many of them future-looking. The last one was fascinating because of the resilience aspect. I wanted to pick up partly on that and partly on what I saw in some of the earlier, more technical presentations. The idea that of protection, recovery, restoration. What I didn't see, though, very much of was any sort of idea about how the rest of society will be developing over the same time periods. Obviously, Torquay and Paynton and some of the other areas that we were seeing have changed probably to a very great extent over the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years in terms of residential areas, commercial areas, where people are living, age structure and all of that, demography. And that's not going to change, that's not going to stop in the future. And I'm wondering if we're missing something, or at least some exploration of how those processes may change in the future. Of course, that is part of what citizens can contribute to what's happening, in that they're building new residences or whatever, or they're applying for planning permission. Then it's about regulation and whether you allow that. But I was just wondering, though, if one should sort of accept a static, static present-day distribution of where people are living and operating, or whether one should really be exploring alternative futures, and I guess there are many out there that one could explore, just to see which policies maybe are sort of robust across many of those possible futures, and which ones maybe are not so robust.
Yeah, so they have been exposed. So population growth that enters, if you look at risk, is hazard. So we focused a bit on hazards, but there's the exposure and the vulnerability. So the exposure is the growth of population that increases your exposure. It's definitely something that you need to tackle. That has to do with planning and zoning and putting not having people build in harm's way or in former floodplain areas. And the other part is the vulnerability. So I think what we're seeing is that losses per GDP are going down, and it's largely accounted for in the reduction in vulnerability. So houses are building stronger, we're more resilient. So I think we're doing a good job. But the exposure part is something, especially in developing countries, that is really driving the increase in risk. And that's already going on, and then that's going to be exacerbated by climate change effects. So a case study, not in this project, but what we did in Indonesia, in Jakarta, is that you see tremendous urban growth. That is a huge part of the equation. And then you get the subsidence, and then you get the sea level rise still going on top of it. So planning is key, difficult in some countries, but it's good to understand that population growth and socioeconomic scenarios are very important to take into account in your next planning phase. So it's being done already, and it's a large part of the equation, cannot be ignored.
Yes, I had a question. We spoke about public engagements, which will be very important, and I had the question, wouldn't it be an idea that in the Water Framework Directive, there's an article which is now the title Public Participation, to change the title in Public Engagement, and think about how we will give content to this public engagement, because now we see that member states have a different, give different content on what we understand on public participation.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes. So the Water Framework Directive and the Floods Directive, well, maybe it's titled the article public participation, but it's about public consultation. I think the word is also included in the text. It's true that these two legal instruments and many others are asking for the authorities, be it national, regional, or local, to consult with the public in the process of preparing their plans and deciding on objectives and on measures. We have seen that, and it has been reported to us, that this is largely happening. What we are not so confident about is what happens with the feedback that the authorities are receiving from the public. But this is, I mean, progress is not working overnight. I mean, we are inquiring about this, what happens. We know in some cases, even a change in the objective can come about. In other cases, there is less impact from the impact. There is less impact from the feedback that is received from the public. In any case, engagement with the public, as I was saying earlier, is quintessential. I wanted to add to what you were saying before in terms of socioeconomic developments. There is a research which suggests that from the additional risk that societies will be facing in the future, 1/3 is coming from climate change. Perhaps that's a simplification now, but it paints the picture. So 1/3 will be coming from climate change, and 2/3 indeed will be coming from socioeconomic development. In Europe, I don't think we are at the risk of an exploding population. 8 years ago, there was a workshop with member states asking about what do you intend to, what are your land use and spatial planning tools, because you need to, as much as possible, keep people out of the danger zone, so away from the floodplain. And there was a lot of thinking to do something. Now we see that there is a lot that has happened already. So either it's absolutely forbidden to build, or it's allowed to build, but then the town planning office wants to see some measures included in the construction. flood reduction or flood protection, or the person who's building must clearly understand that they are building at their own risk, and there may not be support afterwards. So there is also progress on that front, but yeah, I mean, it's not a finished job for sure.
Okay, we have the two last questions.
Good afternoon. Roland Grom. I already made a statement this morning.
No.
I'm representing an end user, and I'm happy to try to challenge this audience with the end user question to know whether there is some help for us as an input or advice. The end user is the insurance industry, French insurance industry. I'm chief executive officer of an association dedicated to risk knowledge and risk reduction, natural hazards, namely. And I already mentioned that this morning. The point is we are right now approaching a prospective study on the impacts of climate change to the French overseas territories, further to what we have already done several times on metropolitan France, and of course, in line with what happened recently with Irma and so on. So my question is simply, do we have something to add, to provide us? Of course, we have asked the same question, and we will take help of French colleagues from French scientist community, but this is a question to the European community with respect to overseas territories. We know there are some other, or even some we share with neighbors.
Probably some of our overseas territories as well, which is actually the sort of maybe two answers to your one question. One is about the societal bit. And I think there are two things. One is, as taxpayers, citizens, we expect those in authority with the roles, responsibilities to protect us from harm, whatever that harm may be, and promote our well-being. So the onus is on us as people, authorities, to do that. But if you take a whole system approach, so if you take your overseas dependencies, territories, and I'm doing the same for some of the British overseas territories as well, which are neighbours probably, or some of yours. If you take a whole system approach and step back and treat the area in question as a system, as an ecosystem, and you look at it in its entirety, what threats, risks, hazards, and vulnerabilities from economic, social well-being, as well as the physical aspects, and you look at that in the whole, and then with all of the organizations responsible, so you understand the shared collective risks, and then you look at capability, roles, responsibilities, and capacity, and then move forward to a set of outcomes, you will address both the socio-economic aspects as well as the physical resilience aspects, and you can treat them as one and deploy the best planning, preparedness, response, and recovery based on that whole system approach. And we're doing that for some of our British overseas territories.
I think that even you can discuss later during the coffee with this topic. Virginia?
My name is Virginia Murray. I come from Public Health England. Fantastic series of presentations. I congratulate you all. But I am slightly heartbroken. You haven't mentioned health very fully. And I think that your research project should be linking much more closely to health. Is there any way you can help us do that?
In Pearl, you looked at health issues, right? In Thailand, disease? Yeah.
I think it's implicit. If you are looking at the protection from harm and the promotion of well-being in a system of systems approach, then you cannot disassociate health from physical, from cyber, it is just part of the risks, threats, vulnerabilities, and hazards. If you don't have a resilient population, then your physical, cyber activities are impossible because your people aren't there to do it. So health is implicit, from my perspective anyway.
within the case study we've been doing, we actually did include some aspects of health. Obviously, when we were looking at the actual costings, etc., some of the cost curves we used do include likes of emergency services, evacuation procedures, etc. We did try and get a lot more details from some of the local hospitals, Torquay Hospital, Paynton Hospital and Brixham Hospital, and they were not forthcoming with any information that they did not want to actually disclose that information to us for inclusion within the case study. So we did try to do it. We wanted to include it in the case study, but we were unable to get the data that we required as part of that case study.
Okay, let me propose to stop here. We have the coffee break and a session that resumes at 4. So we have 25 minutes for the coffee break and be back. And let me thank the panelists for their interventions. And for the question. Oh, and there are some posters in the room with the coffee.
So when we are terminating hopefully at 5:30, I will kindly ask you to leave the room because there is an installation to be done here. Maybe you have seen that at 7 o'clock, there is a kind of social gathering. There will be some music performance. And the musicians have to install their instruments and to make a sound check. So I will kindly ask you, when it's finished, to just take your stuff and leave because there will be a cocktail in the orangery. And then we will rearrange the room accordingly. Thank you very much. Sébastien.
Okay, so good afternoon to everybody and welcome to this very last table for this afternoon. My name is Sébastien Lahaye from Safe Cluster, and I'm happy and very happy and very pleased to chair this amazing table with well, very interesting speakers, as you will see in a moment. But on top of that, very diverse speakers. This table is about forest fires, heat waves, and health. So I think it's a very good way to conclude this session on extreme weather and climate events. We talked about different things today about how the extreme events are coming stronger and stronger, and what the impacts could be in terms of flooding, for example, and geological hazards. And now we'll open to other things. So we'll start talking about networks. I will start. I will have the first talk about the network of practitioners we had and coming to forest fire issue. And then Nicolas will talk about forest fire, and Philippe will talk about climate increasing the temperature in cities. And Virginia complained several times today that health was not discussed on the table before. So, especially for you, Virginia, you will have the last talk. So we will finish definitely this day talking about health, and I think we won't complain about that. So I will introduce you the speakers after. We can try with the first presentation. Every one of us, because that's the end of the afternoon and it's warm and you're probably tired and you're probably waiting definitely for this social event tonight. So we keep our presentation very short, very few slides, and hopefully we'll engage with you because that's what is important. So we'll have time to exchange, and probably half an hour or something like that to exchange on our presentation after that. So I will start talking about the FireIn network. This is a European project that we started last year. This first slide is to illustrate what's the aim of the network, what's the aim of this project. And it a little bit illustrates also what I am, because my background is during 20 years as a fire officer in the south of France, and now doing a little bit of research and looking at this European project and innovative company also. And exactly, that's what we want to do in the FireIn project, and what we have to do actually. The FireIn project aims to improve the national and European fire and rescue capability process. And to do that, the first thing we want to have, and we definitely have, is to have a stronger guidances from practitioners. And that's the starting of the process. Next stages will be to have a feedback from research and from innovation sectors to the responders, so that to inform them to what exists and what can exist. But the first stage is definitely creating a network of practitioners that will say, well, these are our challenges, these are the capability gaps we have in our activities. And well, to do that, we have 16 partners in the project, and lots of them are definitely practitioners. We have the firefighters from Italy are one of the partners. We have fire service from Spain also. We have Czech Association for Fire Officers. So definitely practitioners from different parts of Europe. And we have obviously also research and cross-organizational partners. But the way we did things, we have done things during this first year, is dividing the work in 5 thematic areas. We invited all our networks, all the people we could know or we could join, to register as associated experts in the project. And we have more than 230 associated experts registered now after 1 year, so it's not too bad. And the project is 5 years, so I assume we will have definitely more at the end of the project. And we had the first meetings, first workshops with groups of practitioners in February and March this year. And the question we asked them, well, it was a group of questions and a very strong methodology, so that within 2 days, these practitioners can say, well, these are our capability challenges. So we didn't restrict them to any topic, anything. We didn't ask them to talk about technology or talk about standardization or talk about something precise. We just say them, well, we are there to talk about, let's say, structural fires. What are your challenges? And we had the methodology to get them implied in this. And what I will show you now, because you are interested not in the method for sure, but you are interested in the results. I will show you the first outputs we had from the vegetation fire workshop that we had in Berlin 2 months ago, and some of you were there. And well, we had, after this workshop, we had something like 10 pages of results. So I won't obviously present you all these 10 pages, but just to show you what definitely what's the problem, what's the challenges the responders face. So talking about the keywords we can find in these 10 pages of results, there are some of the main keywords we found. Engaged population. I will come back on that. I will come back on several of these items. Coordination was a very strong keyword in lots of discussions. Cooperation. Standardization. Standardization is an issue because in lots of things we were talking about the necessity for standardization. Rural economy. That's something strange, but something that appears a very key point in vegetation fire area. Situation assessment. And also European Union or European community, generally speaking. There are some expectations from Europe among the the practitioners and just the experts representing lots of countries and not being implied in European project at the beginning, but they have expectation from us and from European Union. Coordination. Well, coordination is all about inter-agencies, inter-operators issue. I mean, when we are talking about wildfire events, forest fire events, we always have different type of agencies that can be implied in the management of the crisis. Do they share their strategy? More or less, no, they don't. We have, apart from the agencies, we have operators, such as critical structure operators. Is it a real exchange of knowledge, of data, of strategy between the agency in charge of managing the event and this operator? Most of the time not. So this is something that was pointed out as a very key point. share the strategy, and again, standardization. I mean, when we are talking about common coordination and control, and the way where different companies, different agencies, different policy makers from a same country or different country work together, we need standardization. Because at a national level, it's very difficult to have different agencies talking the same language and using the same standards. But definitely, we strongly believe, and the experts believe, that this type of standardization may come and should come from a European level, as the American did 20 years ago with their incident command system. So we need something like that in Europe. Cooperation. So it looks like cooperation is like coordination. But we are more talking there about cooperating not when the crisis is there, but probably before. International collaboration. The risk is everywhere, and the risk is going everywhere. The catastrophic fire we had in Portugal last year, we will have them for sure in sometimes, maybe in Spain, France, Italy, or whatever. The fire we had quite every year in France, well, England start to have this type of fire. So we need to exchange this data, these knowledges. We need a network of specialists, fire specialists, that can exchange their data, that can see what's happened in other countries, so that we will be stronger to face the fires. And finally, but not the least, engage population. So we have discussed that several times today and yesterday also. This is the key point. This is definitely the key point. We have to shift the policy from all on response to let's manage the land and let's explain to the population that they are the key part of the challenge now. And firefighter cannot be there to protect your house now. So I heard these things just a few minutes ago talking about floods, but for sure that's the same thing for forest fire. So we have to engage the community. On this picture on the far right, these guys are just escaping a campsite. They were just on holidays, camping, and they are escaping because there is a fire. So were they prepared for that? For sure not. Were the fire services and the policymaker prepared to evacuate this campsite? For sure, no, they were not. And manage the land. So the picture at the bottom of the slide, you probably recognize this picture because I'm quite sure this is close to your home, close to where you live, because this is everywhere in Europe. I mean, on the left side, you have the picture of your neighborhood 100 years ago, and on the right side, the picture of your neighborhood today. What's happened? No more rural activity, no more farming, but instead of that, lots of woods, lots of, we say, fuel, and houses in the forest. So can we step back to the left picture? Probably not. That's too late. But do we have to imagine a new solution? Yes, for sure we have to. And we can do that, I'm quite sure, through this type of community. Well, that's it. And thank you. And I will now let the microphone to Nicolas Fèvre. Nicolas is a policy officer in DG Research and Innovation. He coordinates the files on disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. And before joining the European Commission, he has been engaged in several research projects on forest fires since 2005. In Australia, southern France, eastern Canada, and California. So he has a very large view of the topic, very interesting point. And he completed a PhD on fire ecology in 2011. And today, Nicolas will present the conclusions of scientific review of European projects and their implication for European and national policies dealing with forest fire risk reduction.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Sebastian, for this nice introduction. So what I will present you today is actually how to spark Firewise policies. Well, this is, of course, a dynamic process. I don't intend in 10 slides to show you all the different policy recommendations that came out from the review that we did on the forest fire project. But still, just to say that making the science available to practitioners, to decision makers, is really a major asset for developing risk management strategies, and so this is also what the community of users is about. So thanks for the opportunity to present this work. So I just want to put the facts straight, and before diving into the subject, just picturing a bit the background. So because forest fires, their number and actual area burnt in Europe is actually decreasing over the past years. But that being said, the extreme fire events, so driven by climate and other structural causes, are actually making more damages in Europe. So this reflects both our limits to actually address through policies, so the different socioeconomic and environmental impact of forest fires, but also this results in this type of impact that you can see here. So in terms of human lives lost, in terms of ecosystems damage, and finally economic impacts. So forest fires is definitely a complex issue, which calls to see it through different perspectives. And so here I just highlighted the different policy challenges actually that researchers are facing, for example, when trying to address these issues. So for example, how to promote more resilient landscapes and communities, how to emphasize more on the on prevention compared to suppression, and how to increase awareness through communication, as we saw in the previous panel, during this event. And so the EU, the forest fires are actually a major concern for the EU, and in terms of EU solidarity and support. So this is really active at all stages of forest fire risk management. So from the detection of fires, so in the management of the crisis, to the restoration of post-burnt areas. So on your left, you can see the different European policy areas. So from the EU forest strategy to the Union civil protection mechanism. So this review that Sebastian was talking about, so actually showed the role that research, that science played in supporting operational management and better informed decision making. So in the most recent decade, so if we take the last 20 years, from FP6 to Horizon 2020, but also considering LIFE projects and civil protection funded projects. So about 60 projects received a contribution from the EU, so about 100 million euros. And this concerned not only very large-scale integrated projects, but also Marie Curie fellowships, and also cost actions, so networks of research institutions, and also cooperation between countries. So I'd like actually to take this opportunity to acknowledge the work made by the experts who performed the review, and also from the Commission services who participated in identifying all this research projects within the realm of Commission's funding opportunities. So here is the portfolio of the projects which actually were under investigation. As you can see, it groups into 6 thematics, from looking at fire science, For example, fire behavior modeling, fire social aspects, including health, fire prevention, fire suppression, and post-fire recovery. So all these aspects were actually tackled in many different ways by projects. And this, the area most addressed were obviously fire prevention and fire suppression, but compared to social aspects. But also emerged quite recently this idea of integrated forest fire management, which I will come back later in my talk. So diving into the results, so here is just, well, let's say a teaser of what you will find in the expert report that will be released during the summer. So in terms of advancing our scientific understanding, so the projects and researchers looked at how forest fires are changing, for example, in time and space, how the climate will change and will affect future conditions. So those are just some examples, for example, in terms of how ecosystems respond to fires. Projects like Fume or Firescapes and File so looked at how shifts in vegetation dynamics could occur because of only one single fires and actually transition to another state. In terms of how the climate will affect future fire conditions, well, obviously the predictions are that fire intensity will increase, but where? And those projects actually identified and map different regions under that will actually become very very vulnerable to forest fires and fire hotspots. So in terms of how research contributed to support operational management in terms of tools, methodologies, it's not only about making drones that can map forest fires, but it's also about the techniques such as highlighting how to develop special strategic management points that enable firefighters on the ground to actually tackle contain the fire more effectively. And finally, in terms of better informed decision making, of course, the risk communication, as we saw on the first day during the community of users, is very important and strategic for raising awareness of forest fire risk. I can mention, for example, the toolkit produced by FireLife and eFirecom, but also how to estimate wildfire risk probability and severity at different scales. In that respect, so the ArcFuel project mapped forest vegetation, characterized the different fuel types in Europe, and using FIS classification, so the project was able to produce reliable and accurate estimation of wildfire spread and behavior. So how do we actually put all this knowledge, all these pieces together? Well, this is a working diagram, of course, but it gives you actually an idea of what is this concept, this approach of integrated fire management. So how to bring together all the human, physical, ecological elements that have an influence on forest fires, whether they are, it's related to the management of biomass or to the management of emergencies, from social aspects to actually economic growth. So this integrated, this holistic approach aims actually to bring this element together, but also to, it's actually also looked at all the steps within the management of forest fires, so from the detection of the fires to the post-fire, to the recovery of, to the building back better after the fire. So of course this coming from the review, but also from the workshop that we organized with different stakeholders earlier this year. So a number of recommendations arose, and to actually seize the momentum and provide general recommendation for both EU policies, but also at national level. And of course, this is just a summary, but as was mentioned before, so promoting the knowledge exchange and dissemination through a common repository of research projects. This is very important, and both the Disaster Risk Management Knowledge Center and the community of users are very important tools in that respect. I mentioned within integrated fire management how to bring different elements together. So here, recommendation related to how to maximize the benefits of proper fire management through bioeconomy is also something that needs to be looked at. And then I'm almost finished. And about risk awareness, so through targeted education curricula, to change the perception of communities and to put them really at the center of management of forest fires, and making them also accountable, the same as was mentioned for fraud risk management. So the integrated fire management so then should focus on balancing more the investment, so from suppression to prevention, looking at the training as well and the exchange between communities, and finally looking at the adaptive management of forest. So how to maximize the resources. So this is it. Thank you for your attention, and well, I'd be happy to answer your question after that. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicolas, and thank you for summarizing such a big work in such a few times. So that was great. Thank you. Now, Philippe Lefebvre is a physicist with a PhD in climate modeling. He's working at VITO, or should I say VITO, I'm not sure we would say that, for 17 years on environmental modeling services for regional, national, and international clients. He currently focuses on business development, international activities, and partnerships for the Urban Climate Service Group. He's project manager on the ongoing H2020 Pan-European Urban Climate Services and Copernicus European Health Projects. And he will talk to you about the lessons learned from two recently finished projects on the impact of climate change at the urban scale, and introduction to the Urban Climate Service.
Thank you, Sebastian, for the very nice introduction. So I only have to do half of the job myself now. So maybe just about VITO. So VITO stands for the Flemish Institute of Technological Research. So we're about 700 people, and we're located in the north of Belgium, near the Dutch border. And I'm from the environmental modeling division, working on urban climate services. So, and we have a special website for that. Okay, so as said by Sebastian, we were partner in two recently finished European projects, the NACLIM and the Ramses projects, in which we developed expertise on how to assess and model urban climates. And in the Ramses project, the framework was the quantification of impacts of climate change on urban areas and the quantification of adaptation options, cost-benefit analysis. So where we, as the climate modeler, provided the input for the impact assessments, because, okay, you need detailed climate information. And in the NACLIM project, the project was about the North Atlantic Oscillation, and we have been downstream service quantifying the impact on urban areas from that phenomenon. In the Climate Fit City project, which is only recently started, so it's quite early in the project, I have very little to show for the moment. So this is a project in the call from the demonstration of climate services with the focus on urban areas. And we have 6 demo cases, and one of them is on health also. But other ones are on urban planning, building energy, climate change impacts cooling and heating of buildings. We have a case on cultural heritage. The exploitation of cultural heritage sites and urban areas is also impacted by the climate. We have a case on active mobility. Cycling and walking in cities is impacted by weather and climate. I think I have had, and emergency planning is also an important one. So, but more on that in other meetings, hopefully. So I don't need to stress this, but if you look at heat waves, they are, in terms of death toll, the most important natural disasters. So I think flooding is, in terms of monetary cost, the biggest. If you look at health, death cases, heat waves are very deadly. So also remember the 2003 European heat wave, but also more recently, 2015, there has been a European heat wave. So, and also, this is a very recent paper by Forzieri from Joint Research Center, really quantifying the health impacts of natural disasters. And okay, heat waves are by far the most important ones. And okay, to give you some numbers, so actually to date, there's about 3,000 deaths to heat waves annual on average in Europe. By the end of the century, in a business as usual scenario, this amounts to 150,000. So, and if you then indeed quantify this by the value of a life, you come up to very impressive numbers. So, okay, but coming down to the urban areas, so why do we focus on urban areas? If you look at, for example, at this slide, it shows you that the increased mortality during the 2003 heat wave is much larger in urban areas compared to rural areas or smaller cities. Okay, and part of the explanation is, of course, the urban climate. There's probably also, I'm sure, also an effect of aging population, more elderly people in cities compared to rural areas. But urban climate has an important role over there. So what is the urban heat island effect? Maybe you're familiar with it. I'm not so sure, so I have one slide on it. So it's the effect that urban areas, due to their nature, buildings, concrete, asphalt, roads, obstacles, they capture the heat and release it during the night. You come up with much higher temperatures in cities compared to the rural backgrounds. It's in fact a nighttime phenomenon. For example, in Antwerp, we measured during a hot day up to 8 degrees Celsius difference between the outskirts of Antwerp and the city center. And Antwerp is not that major. It's a big city of Flanders, but worldwide it's not that big. So, okay, that's the nighttime effect. You also have a daytime effect. If you look at what we call human comfort indices, such as wet bulb globe temperature, the radiation effects of buildings, the less ventilation in urban areas also leads to increased heat stress during the day in cities. Okay, you have benefits and you have positive effects. For example, if you look at heating costs, they will be lower in urban areas compared to rural areas. But also, if you look at the downside, there are very big health effects. So these are two results from the ongoing project, the Climate Fit City. Here you see maps from detailed maps at 100-meter resolution. So what we do is we start from global climate models, and we downscale this towards 100-meter resolution using European available data sets of land use, soil sealing, vegetation. So we make use of the land, Copernicus Land Service, and so on. So on the left side, you see the city of Barcelona, where, for example, in the summer of 2011, you see on average, this is the 2-meter mean temperature. In city center, it can be 6 degrees warmer than in the outskirts, 6 to 7. There's also a topography effect here. If you know Barcelona, it's quite hilly. But then if you look at on the right-hand side, this is the city of Rome, which is, I think, less hilly. You have here, this is for the summer of 87. You have up to 5 degrees temperature difference between areas inside the city of Rome. So it's quite important. So we recently also did a study for the city of Brussels where, for example, they asked us not to focus on the hot areas, but to look for the cool spots in terms of solutions. So, and then this will give rise for them. That's the basic information to do an analysis in terms of adaptation measures. Where do we need more cool spots and so on. If we look at the number of heat wave days in the city of Antwerp, this is from the Ramses project, the NACLIN project. On the left-hand side, you see the current pattern. So it's about, in the city center, 2 to 3 times more heat wave days than the outskirts. If we go to the far end of the century, RCP 8.5, you see that it increases by a factor of 10. So 10 times more heat wave days by the end of the century in the city center compared to today. But this is not only something in Antwerp. We did this analysis for a number of cities in the project. And here you see that one of the conclusions so we did this for Lisbon, Skopje. You can read the names of the city. So on the top you see again the current climate conditions. And then we have a bit the same conclusion as in Antwerp, that in the city center it's about a factor of 2 to 3 higher than in the rural outskirts. If you then go to the end of the century, then you see that it increases by a factor of 10 to nearly 30 days, heatwave days a year, which means that, for example, the summer of 2003 will become a normal summer in those cities in terms of heatwave days. So, this is just quantifying the problem, but if you think about resilience and secure societies, and we work a lot with the city of Antwerp, for example, for them, having these results is the start of thinking about the solution. So, and the solution is not one measure. It consists of many measures. So it consists of social measures, how to make sure that your population is able to cope with the heat, that they are aware of the heat, take care of the elderly people. It's a societal challenge also. But also it's an infrastructure challenge. You have to make sure that you create an urban environment in which there are enough green spaces, school spots for people that do not have access, do not have air conditioning at home, but so that they can escape the heat for a while and recover. Because it's the mortality, I'm not a health specialist, but Virginia will maybe tell more about it. It's the fact, for example, that during the night you cannot recover from the heat during the day that creates the mortality. So this is what I wanted to tell you. So if you have more questions, feel free to ask. Thank you.
Thanks, Philippe. And I think the weather decided to illustrate in Brussels your talk about urban warming. Now, I'm not sure I have to introduce Virginia, because it looks like everybody heard about you, Virginia, but anyway, I will do. Virginia is a previous frontline practitioner, academic. She's now working in government as a public health doctor based at Public Health England, United Kingdom. She focuses on global disaster risk reduction and have been much engaged in the support for health, science and technology to inform the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, as well as in its implementation. So that's to make very short, and she will talk us finally about the links between extreme events and health.
Thank you for your lovely introduction. And it's a great privilege to be able to talk about health. I'm the last one, you see, on the list. As always, we're a bit forgotten. But you won't forget, I hope, by the end of this. To me, it is a huge privilege to be here, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to speak, because I'm not linking to a single one of your research projects. You gave me that wonderful challenge, Miguel, and I'm going to enjoy it. So I do many different things, as you mentioned, but it's quite a collection. And I don't think we could have done anything without the incredible support of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That, I think, really raised the game, didn't it, Philippe? It made us understand that there is a close association between managing the risks of extreme events and disasters to advance climate change adaptation. It was such a critical report that it really had huge impact on the governments. After all, science wants us to lead to make sure that we inform policy and practice. And I had the great privilege of being the first author of the last chapter on case studies, where we did include, of course, a case study on the 2003 and 2006 heat waves. But to me, the Sendai framework was really, in many ways, a baby of that incredible report, along with many other reports that helped to drive this. And this was driven totally by the UN member states. I was merely an observer supporting the science and technology implementation of the Sendai framework and how we could deliver it. And the strong message that I thought was so important was that in the major outcome message was that we will look for the substantial reduction of disaster risks and losses in lives, livelihoods, and health. So we got health in there. So health is critical and absolutely at the heart of it, because if we don't have health, we are not sustainable. And in the economic, physical, social, cultural, and economic assets of persons, businesses, communities, and countries. And indeed, in her introduction, Margareta Wallström said that health resilience is strongly promoted throughout. This was by the UN member states. It was not by us. They asked for it. They've suddenly realized that if we don't solve health, we will be at risk. And that is very much supported by our new Director General of the World Health Organization, who said that a healthy community is a resilient community. So really reflecting on what Lawrence said earlier, that resilience is key, but you've got to be healthy to do it. Now, we've seen the most incredibly rich series of wonderful research programs. I'm really impressed by what you've all achieved. I'm really engaged and stimulated by them. But as you'll see by the end of it, I'm just really sad that we haven't managed to get health included at the heart of many of these to help to use your incredible knowledge more effectively to deliver better results for our communities. So out of this one from Helix, I thought I would start with floods, because we had that session on flooding earlier this afternoon, and I thought it'd be really important to pick it up. I don't know how many of you know, but the World Health Organization Regional Office for Europe has been the hub of much of the thinking on what the health impacts might be, and Public Health England has had the great privilege of working closely hand in hand with them to build the evidence that was absolutely critical to deliver this report. And this report has now gone to not only all the 53 countries of the WHO Regional Office for Europe, but it's also driven these countries to make their own plans for how we reduce health impacts from flooding. But what we need is to make sure the science you have links to it closely. Now, in the UK, there are many different papers we've done, but I'm trying not to overburden you with the massive images, but I thought I would take you to how we work with our stakeholders right at the front line. The strong message from our working groups, our little stakeholder groups, was that people who are flooded need only a single source of advice. They do not want the world and his wife to offer different nuggets. It has to be agreed and done in one way. I see a nice nod or two here. Thank you for your support. So we really worked hard to bring together everything we needed to produce this single leaflet. Now, obviously, we're much engaged with what you plan to do before a flood happens, what to do in a flood, and most importantly, to recover. And Public Health England has been at the heart of this delivery. And it's really with our work through the Environment Agency and many others that we've been able to develop something that is pictorially explicit and simple to use and very welcome, we are told, by those in our communities. And that's what we needed to do. So, as usual, the UK never lets you down. It gets very wet. In fact, really soggy. Truly damp, and this was a very bad winter that we had from December the 1st, 2013 to the 19th of February, 2014. And you can see that it did hit the core, the centre of London, particularly our capital, and that always raises the interest of our politicians. But actually, it was everywhere and a huge problem for all. Now, what we wanted to do was to try and understand what the impacts were, and there are many projects that have come out of this because we organised a risk register, but I just wanted to share one paper, and you have to accept that I am a public health epidemiologist in part, so you'll know that it's a cohort study, it's a cross-sectional analysis of the neighbourhoods that were affected. We had validated instruments to screen probable psychosocial morbidity, and we looked at prevalence and odds ratios. So that's the science. But the content was the first English national cohort study of flooding and the health cross-sectional analysis of mental health at year 1 of the cohort after the floods. We divided them into 3 groups: those who were flooded, those who were disrupted, and those who were not flooded. And in order to publish this paper, we had to seek political approval. Because when I show you the next slide, you will see the impacts on those that were flooded and disrupted are, in my view, shocking. Over 80% of those in the cohort who were flooded had mental health impacts, be it probable depression, anxiety, or post-traumatic stress disorder. But equally, those who were disrupted were well over 35%. The baseline for being people nearby, theirs was nearly 20%. So the shock on the whole community is enormous. And understanding these mental health impacts as just one example of the many effects of flooding is something I think we should invest in and be much more engaged with. So Nature Climate Change published a special April issue reflecting that the focus on climate change and mental health is critical. And we had the great honor of producing one of the two major papers, and ours was about the case for systems thinking about climate change and mental health. Because if we do not think about the impacts on the mental health of climate change, I think we will make our populations so much more vulnerable. And I think there's a real need to do this very widely. So let's turn to something rather more pleasurable, rather like the weather today. Everybody likes a bit of sun, don't they? We all feel a bit better for it, unless we become ill. And heat waves, just as we've been discussing by Philippe, is something that really causes huge problems. Now, the heat waves are not actually so inducing of mortality as cold weather, but that's another story, and I'm not going to tell it today. But I am going to show you some of the things that we've used on the shocking events of 2003, where approximately 70,000 people were thought to have died from the heat wave in August that year. In the UK, we identified a spike of those that were over 75, of about 2,500 excess deaths in that period. It's a clear spike, we can see it well, and the consequence was that we knew we had to start planning. We had to prepare ourselves, not only us in public health, but us across the government, but most importantly, our communities at risk. So we wrote the heatwave plan for England, which is regularly updated every year. It's very important for use, but because I'm a nerd, we write the evidence with it. So we publish at the same time making the case why we do the plan. So if people are worried that they haven't got the evidence, they can look it up easily in a user-friendly way. But we also publish advice for many different groups who are targeted by this plan to make sure we give them specific information that is really tangible and effective. So does it work? Well, the first thing is that our plan runs to 4 levels. 0 is fine, 2 we're getting a bit warmer, and even with this little moment of heat, we have not raised the heat wave alert in the UK yet. But 3 is when we start getting really worried, and 4 is when the Cabinet Office gets cross with us, because it's always our fault. So let me take you to 2013. Another heat wave, another event, another drama. Thank goodness for the Met Office providing such clear images of where the heat islands are. You'll see that London is very hot, but so are other parts of the country. And what we have in health is something that we discussed earlier today, is a way of accessing data. We can access data daily. We have incredible resources through our syndromic surveillance network. We can get it even from over-the-counter sales of medication. We can get it through telehealth. We can get it through emergency department logistics. We even know about the ambulance call-out times. We can get GP out of hours. Web activity. People go onto the web to ask for information. We can assess it. We can look at absenteeism from work, because obviously work is very closely related to the health. GP in-hours, social media, sentinel GPs. You pull that together and you have data. And you can do it weekly or daily. So this is what the central England temperature looked like. It doesn't look very clear that we've got a terrible heat wave cooking, but we have. Because then you'll see when we started going from level 1 to level 3 and level 2 in our heat wave alerts, and you start seeing the health impacts coming through. both in NHS Direct, emergency departments, GP out of hours, and other groups. We can spot heat waves by using this method. It may not be perfect, but it is better than what we had before, and we can send out the warning and informing in time. What matters is mortality. And our colleagues did a major review of the 2003, 2006, 2009, 2011, and 2013 mortality data. I think you'll agree, although the authors of this paper did not say so, having a heatwave plan helped to drive our reduction in mortality. But there are other aspects from heat waves that I think are important. Drowning. Did you know people go swimming more often in heat? And they're more likely to drown. And also the water gets shallower, so they can dive in and break their necks and backs, which are terrifying, terrible physical injuries. We get ozone and air pollution that comes up. Oh, and yes, of course, we have wildfires, which is why I'm wearing a red jacket for you today, Sebastian, just to say I, too, am involved in how we deal with these events. Of course, wildfires produce air pollution, but they produce other health consequences of real note, which I will not go through at the moment, but I've been sharing our wildfires paper with a few. But algal blooms, not only do they affect where you swim, but also the food you eat. And then, of course, you can have thunderstorms. And did you know thunderstorms generate thunderstorm asthma? There's been an episode in Melbourne where they really stopped the health service completely and several people died and caused huge anxieties in Australia. But I don't think we're prepared in Europe for it, although we're increasingly prepared in the UK. And finally, of course, after this discussion we had this afternoon, when it rains, when the ground is hard, you get flooding and you get pollution runoff. So heat can be a European and even a UK issue. That's last year. I'm sure we'll get better this year. What do we do about it? Well, the World Health Organization has been really critical in working with the World Meteorological Organization and has published very recently Heat Waves and Health, Guidance on Warning System Development. The thing that frightens me is I'm not certain how many of our European partners are actually implementing this now, and we need to get more engagement. But we also need it across the world. India is very much at risk, as are many other countries. But we also have an atlas on heat and health and climate. You might want to look that up. I found it a really useful resource and was privileged to be part of that. But the best thing that happened on the 31st of May is WMO and WHO have jointly decided to tackle the health impacts of pollution, extreme weather, and climate change. Maybe we'll have this joint network to deliver more, but I know we'll need better evidence and better science to support it. So this is my call to the wonderful European Commission to help us to deliver this. But we can't just do it like that. We have a huge range of emergency fact sheets and disaster risk management. This is our climate change management fact sheet, which we've written with UNISDR, WHO, and Public Health England again. Just 2 pages to explain to our colleagues some of the issues. So, in conclusion, forest fires, heat waves, and health. Have I persuaded you that health matters? Have I won? Hands up for those who think it's important. Okay, I say that's about 70%. That'll do. I'll accept that. So to me, the Sendai framework, the SDGs, and the Paris Agreement provide measurable opportunities to really deliver by enhancing research, to inform capabilities to plan, prepare for, respond to, recover from disasters and other public health emergencies. And it offers an opportunity to engage at a global level with stakeholders on guidance and policy issues that could impact upon state and local preparedness. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Virginia, to conclude this series of talk and opening the discussion, probably to question. I'm quite sure that you will have questions on this subject or the other. So the ground is open. Who will be first?
I don't always have to go first. I had another brilliant panel. I'd like to look back in history. In the 19th century, England was one of the, well, England is the birthplace of industry, and it was the place that was the most air polluted in the whole world. And there were so many efforts to count the cost in terms of health, including health. And people actually knew, and they could tell, they could see that people, plants, buildings, everything was dying because of it. Nothing happened until 1952. There was a smog in London, and it killed, well, the figures, I'm not entirely sure, it was between 4,000 and 12,000 people. But my question there is, when you connect the dots between all of today, really, wildfires are a symptom of climate change, the health implications are a clear cost of that. I wonder how the work that you're doing enables a sense of crisis to arise before we get to those kind of catastrophic effects.
So, who wants to answer first? Virginia?
If I may. Great question, Monica. Thank you. To me, counting mortality is critical. And one of the requirements inside the Sendai framework is to count the deaths from disasters and to try and reduce them. But actually, I don't think we have a good baseline to move from. And it's really hard to count deaths from disasters, because sometimes you're constrained to just count them within 1 month of a disaster. And we know that deaths will continue for much longer than a month afterwards if we are to follow the health impact story fully. So it's very hard to be able to do this, but until we learn the techniques of using data well and using affected populations as well as the mortality data, we're going to struggle to show how bad the problem is. Yes, that air pollution smog in London was terrible. And I think because of that, we know that we have to have a driver, and how we can stop that happening is by really engaging with many and getting much better local information. Local counting of death data may be something that's very much required. We cannot rely on doctors writing on death certificates. It's not good enough.
Yeah, so probably Philip could add something.
A very short comment also. I interpret your question also in terms of okay, how do we get the media and the population and the politics going over to action? And okay, when I'm making the comparison with the air quality case in Belgium and Flanders, that I know also quite well. And okay, I have been also air quality expert. And okay, we know, the experts know that the problem exists for a long time, but okay, you still see that it's not taken up by politics, not really by the media, and sometimes you need an extreme event or something, when it's picked up by the media, and then the chances are higher that the politics are also more concerned, but it's a different ball game to get the attention of the media, because there's so much that they want to talk about. But it's important. And I think as a scientist, we probably have to do better efforts also to interact with the media and with the politics, because we know the problem, evidence-based data is important to communicate with them.
Okay. Thank you. So we have another question, maybe. Yeah. So where is the microphone? Okay. No, the microphone is coming to you. It looks like this health issue are inspiring our English colleagues.
Thank you. Health. Well, I'm not a scientist. I'm more of an advertising man, actually. So I was quite intrigued by your very simple message about the heatwave plan. So underpinned by huge amounts of data and understanding. So I guess I have two questions, really. One is, do you have any data, either hard data or sort of less hard, to understand whether that very simple message about the heatwave plan had an effect, either in reduction of people suffering from heatwave or less casualties, etc., etc. And also, again, as an advertising guy, is it really as simplistic as where you have consequences such as heatwave casualties and symptoms and so on? Could you take the same approach and have other very simple messages and therefore plans for those other symptoms and consequences of health-related issues, such as, I don't know, asthma or, sort of in cold weather and so on, which again could be underpinned by robust data, but have a very simple message to prevent and reduce.
Thank you, Lawrence. A wonderful question to ask. To me, the only advantage of a plan is that you review it every year. You evaluate it, you spot a problem, and then you try and fill the gap. So let me tell you about a failure. We thought we had a great plan. We thought we had communicated it well, and I'll tell you what we do for that. When we had analysed the data in about 2014 of one of the heat waves, we found that the group that we had entirely missed were school children at school sports days. We did not provide the advice that you could either change the time of a sports day, that you could put on hats, sun cream, and give fluid, lots of fluid to the kids, or even stop a sports day if it was too hot. And there was no support for the schools who did do that because parents got upset. And there were a lot of concerns. So we found that one of the things that we did when we looked at the evidence, we found that a lot of kids went to general practitioners with sunburn and were dehydrated after school sports days when we analysed it. So we've now tried to deal with that by providing better guidance and warning and informing more effectively through the educational system as well as through the health system. So one of the advantages of valuation is where you spot a problem and you see what you think works, but actually shows you what does not work. One of your messages from earlier, because I like what works and what does not work. You ask about how we communicate. The best communication always is your family, your friends, your neighbours. They are the people who provide you with the advice you will trust most quickly. Maybe your healthcare professionals, maybe finally to the media. And when we have heat waves, we put out very clear messages of go in, cool down, stay out of the sun, the relevant messages for that particular weather, and we make it short, sharp, and brief, and we try and provide it in every forum that might be required. But the best way of doing it is to try and get all of us aware that there's a problem and making sure that they know what to do. So that partnership that we need to build between the meteorological services, the education services, the school services, the community services, the health services, but most importantly, for you to trust your neighbour and to do something sensible and look out for those who are particularly vulnerable, maybe the elderly, is how we try and get our messages across. I don't know whether that is a good advertising technique, but we've tried really hard to work at a very local level with our critical evaluations of what we do. And yes, we do use that type of technique because Public Health England employs about 5,000 people. We're really lucky. We're equivalent to about a large teaching hospital in the UK. And in there, we have a marketing team of about 70 people who give us great advice. And yes, we do look at healthy lifestyles and blood pressure and respiratory coughs and all sorts of things. But we also have a fantastic communications team who work with us to try and make sure our messages are right. But none of this would work if you didn't have the evidence and the best of the science that we can find at the time and the partnerships of building that science with many. And we're really grateful for all the scientists who come to work with us to try and evaluate, assess, engage, improve. And they come to our annual meetings to tear us off a strip, but also to tell us how we might work better. And it's the local frontline communities that are the ones that make the best difference, the local people who help us to deliver it.
Right. Philippe, do you want to add something to that? No, okay. Just the time for the microphone to travel, maybe at the right of the room. May I ask a question to Nicolas? You mentioned that we have to move from an integrated fire management studies now and to raise the community awareness. So my question is, don't you think that for that we have to imply more social science, and this is to say more social scientists? I'm not sure there are lots of them represented in this room, and I'm not sure they have been implied that much in the last studies we had in field of forest fire. So any reflection or any idea on this subject?
Yes. This one? Okay. No, definitely, I think and it's not only to please my neighbor, but of course, social science have to be very much involved in forest fire research. Well, just an example from the FUME project, who looked actually at where do fires actually do occur. Well, they occur obviously in forested area, but also within the interface. So of rural and wildland with urban interface area. So the cause, the socioeconomic actually factors are very important in determining where fires do occur. So looking at this involvement in integrated fire management, the challenge will be actually to reconcile the objectives of, for example, economical growth with social health, with conservation of natural areas. So all these different objectives of maybe connect policy, but that actually sometimes are conflicting. So this is the future challenge of forest fire research.
So I think we have two more questions, maybe. Yeah.
Richard Betts from Med Office and University of Exeter. So this is perhaps for all panel members. I wonder if we need to think more about human behaviour and how we respond to previous events and the risk of being caught out by surprises with unprecedented events. I mean, for example, with heat waves, the 2003 heat wave, there were a lot of deaths because it was particularly unusual at a particular time of year in Paris with a particular demographic not being, vulnerable people not being looked after and so on. In the case of forest fires, wildfires, there have been cases in Australia where bushfires have been caught people out. They've tended to try and stay and defend their homes because they thought that could be done, but then when the fire is more extreme than has ever been seen before, then they get caught out and trapped. So am I right in thinking that this human behaviour aspect is an area that we still need to do a lot more, and rather than just predicting what's going to happen physically?
Maybe I'll give you some insight about forest fires. So thanks for your question, because as much as it's important to raise awareness on what to do during a fires, it's also very important to look at how the fires initiates in the first stage. And looking at Europe, so where 95% of fires are from human negligence, I believe it's important to look at those patterns in, for example, for arson on forest fires, to look at patterns of what is traditional burning, for example, a source of forest fires in a particular area. But then, of course, the work that has been done on identifying the causes, the work on raising awareness on for local communities on what to do during the fires is critical, as you've seen in Portugal. So the people who escaped their homes actually were killed in roads, so in the forest. And so it has to be some practical guidelines and information have to be conveyed actually to rural population where, for example, these fires may occur. Thanks.
Yeah, just a brief reaction. So I already told it in my speech, but I think for example, for heat stress in urban areas, of course, human behavior is important so that people know what to do during a heat wave, so that they are informed, that they can adapt their behavior. But I stress the fact that also urban planning should be adapted so that people can get access to cool spots, for example, can get access to places where there is, for example, air conditioning available, or also the building of houses. There's a lot of attention now to construct houses that are well isolated and for CO2 emission reduction purposes, but on the other hand, we have to make sure that the houses that are built today will last many, many years, that they're also adapted to more heat stress moments. So, okay, it's not only human behavior, but it is important. I agree with you.
I suggest, because we are short of time, so I suggest to take the two last questions and to answer to these questions, please. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think that in the context of wildfires and risk management, there should be a possibility to do more, and in certain critical areas. So the authorities should ensure safe roads, and if not possible, or perhaps in addition, to have safety bunkers where people who are aware of the availability of such bunkers can regroup in case of wildfires and save their lives and possibly also save their cars. So, I mean, there should be more consideration towards building this kind of bunkers, and also this could be very useful for firemen who are trapped and could go to such places in order to save their lives. Thank you.
Yeah, so I just a comment on that. That's something that was discussed during our workshop, and you're right. This is a concern and a challenge in some parts and regarding some types of fires. But again, this is very much complicated, and when we are talking about public awareness and self-shelters, we have to consider different types of fire, different type of landscapes, and this may be a solution somewhere, but it won't be for sure in other places. And this is part of the things we have to take in account in the discussion. And when we are working on such projects, is that something that looks like the best solution can be just not the good solution for other situations. So we have to consider that very carefully. Yes, so the last question, thank you.
Yes, again, from the maybe not only the insurance perspective, as I address perhaps mainly to Virginia, but not only, I was very impressed by her presentation in general, but in particular the product or the campaign based on health. So the way you have achieved to produce information media, let me say that like that, to raise awareness to the people about health issues. And my question is about the extension of the coalition approach you may have put in this endeavor, considering a trend which we are trying to follow, not issuing awareness-raising campaigns from our side only, but pushing this from the largest basis of common understanding, be it public, private, and associative all together, as, of course, it is emphasized by United Nations recommendations. And I really appreciate what you have presented from your understanding of the health as being the core issue for everybody to raise their awareness. And I can tell you that I will come back and make my best to replicate, because we have as contacts your counterparts in France. They came to us to get data from the insurers. They were disappointed, of course. It was a long time ago. Now times have changed. And we may come back with another approach, like you have, and try to go in communication, so to go in social sciences, and to take politics with all the difficulties you raised, the sensitivity of addressing that approach of health issues with respect to awareness raising and taking action at individual level. But from the perspective of the insurers, I think it's also what we could do the best, because we also insure science. We also insure health, in addition to social health.
So as promised, Virginia, the final word is for you.
Thank you. What a privilege. I mean, to me, I think it's really important to know that we work in partnership. The partnerships we've had with the European Commission for many of the research projects we have done have been absolutely critical on how we deliver our work. And I hope whatever happens in the future, that will continue in one way or another. For us, we use WHO Europe for many of our local European regional actions, and there's been a huge drive to try and get many of the European countries, the 53, that would sit inside the World Health Organization or Regional Office for Europe, to develop heatwave plans, and this is measured through various evaluations on crisis assessment, but also on the international health regulations and the joint external evaluations for global health security. But we have other ideas. So we feel it's absolutely critical that we support a WHO, WMO network called the Global Heat Health Information Network to try and grow regionally, globally, the need to have a system by which we can share knowledge more easily. We've talked about knowledge hubs for wildfires, absolutely critical. And when we did our original systematic literature review on wildfires, of course we found the air pollution issues to be of real import. But I was very glad about the comments that was made about the fact that there are road traffic accidents. People can't see in the smoke, they drive into each other. So that's a behavioral issue. But there are other behavioral issues, such as the fact that arson occurs. And that's one of the things that we really need to work on as quickly as we can. And we've been doing a lot of work on that, particularly in Wales, where I'm told it's very fashionable for young men to prove that they're a man, is to go and start a wildfire. And so the fire brigades are much engaged in trying to reduce this type of habit of behavior and to make sure we reduce the risks because of the impact upon the whole of the community. So there are many issues we need to address, and I think we'll only do it if we work together. And my main message is that people care about their health. They want to be well. They wish to be resilient. Why don't we use this as the way to open the door to get engagement across all the issues around climate change adaptation, and indeed disaster risk reduction and disaster risk management, if we can. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks for that. And before joining for a warm upload to our panelists and probably all the panelists of this very long and very, very interesting days, I just repeat what that Philippe strongly encouraged us to leave the room now. So please take your staff and go on discussing and networking outside, and they need to do some things in this room, and so that it's ready for the last session, the most important session of this day, the social things. So let's join, please, to applaud our panelists. Thank you.